Okay, so we'll push a little further along. Cover some of the things we need to cover. Since we had the speaker last time, we stopped with thinking about Edward Bellamy. Remember, I wanted you to think about that book and its significance. I tried to set up this larger theme of culture and politics coming together, a theme we'll revisit later. Um, Culture and politics, again, often come together, although we think of them as separate sort of spheres in a way. I want you to think about how culture is often very political in a sense. Again, we've seen several examples of this just in the last couple of weeks. If any of you saw Lady Gaga's performance recently at the Oscars, or Kendrick Lamar, his performance, you'll definitely get a sense of culture and politics coming together in 2016, and sort of what they're trying to say and symbolize, particularly around things around race and gender and other issues. But not just those issues. Culture can often be a political vehicle. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward was just such a thing in the 1890s. Its cultural significance was far beyond, I think, what he could have anticipated. Really far beyond what he could have anticipated. He writes this book in 1888 called Looking Backward. And what it was a novel, fictional, but its impact is really going to be very heavily felt in the society he was living in. I told you it was the century's best-selling novel after Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which in and of itself was a very politically important cultural vehicle in terms of the abolitionist movement, bringing on the Civil War, highlighting the problems with slavery and whatnot. Looking backward, in some ways, is also going to challenge its society to think about itself, to think about progress, to think about American identity, as many people were doing at that sort of historical moment. So it's interesting that he's able to accomplish that, not with a speech, not with a political speech, but with a novel. In some respects, you think culture may have even more of an impact than any speech, right? As many people as may watch the debates, more people may watch a movie, for example, that impacts politics in certain ways. So in his novel, it was a utopian novel. Actually, Professor Rydell, who spoke to us, is teaching a utopias class this semester. He teaches it once a year. There have been various utopian movements in this country's history and in world history where people choose to challenge their society in various ways. So it's kind of a utopian novel about a man waking up in the year 2000. This man wakes up in the year 2000. Remember, he's writing it in 1888, or it's published in 1888. But it's the guy waking up in the year 2000 after having been asleep for more than 100 years. So this guy's falling asleep. He wakes up. What does the world look like when he wakes up? What does his country look like? And so it's kind of Bellamy's vision, and he's going to use this man's vision to put out some things and really make people think about some things. Right, he realizes that Americans had solved all their major problems. That's utopian, this idea of progress and kind of the perfect society in a way. We've solved all our major problems like poverty, crime, war, taxes, even housework has been addressed. This notion of housework as significant. Everyone has lives of comfort in Looking Backward. The novel would stress community. Right? He hadn't, of course, read Benedict Anderson because Benedict Anderson wasn't born yet. But he's stressing this idea of community and coming together around notions of community and cooperation. Community and cooperation. And so that's how the world is going to solve its problems. That's how the country, the nation is going to solve its problems. Collective ownership of the people. Right? Sounds a lot like some Bernie Sanders type stuff. Right? This notion that collective ownership could be a cure for some of the difficulties. This is kind of the opposite of capitalism in a sense, where individual ownership is really driving things, right? Collective ownerships. Politicians actually work for the public good. And imagine that. Some may say that makes it fiction, but we've seen some politicians, at least, that are willing to do that, sort of sacrifice themselves for the larger good. The work day in Bellamy's world, the work day is only 4 hours long. It's interesting that, remember, unions and others in this position are fighting for an 8-hour workday to get it down from 12 hours and more down to 8 hours, saying that's more humane and whatnot. Whereas the owners of factories are saying, well, wait a second, that's going to cut productivity. People are working less, they're going to be less productive. Right? In this world, the 4-hour workday is seen as the ideal. 4-hour workday. Vacations are 6 months of the year. I like that idea. 6-month vacations. Maybe we'd work harder those other 6 months, learn more in school. If we knew that we could go to Cancun for the other 6 months out of the year, who knows? This is the vision coming out of looking backward, and I think it's interesting that it becomes so popular. Right? There's culture, and then there's popular culture. What is it that makes something become popular? We had some of these discussions around tipping point. Right? There's something about it that gravitates in the society, and people are gravitate towards this, which tells you something about their desires, perhaps, in the society. 6-month vacations, retirement at age 45. I'd be getting close. I'm ready. I put my feet up. Some kind of sandy beach somewhere without snow on it. At 45, right? Again, we think of retirement age now, 65. 45 is their utopian vision. This utopian vision is really kind of based on that historical moment, especially on thinking about the pace of technological change at that moment. Pace of technological change. And I think this is interesting. You guys, perhaps understand some of this. Your grandparents, perhaps even more than our generation. Think about the mental investment kind of in technology and how rapidly things seem to have changed just in the 20th century. You go from railroads to automobiles to airplanes to space travel, all in one century. This is a rapid set of changes just in 1 century that, say, people your grandparents' age would have lived through. Internet, television. These things didn't exist previously. So in some ways, maybe we understand this a little better in terms of technology. People at this time are seeing how rapidly things are changing, and they're saying, well, if they're changing this rapidly in the 1890s, by the year 2000, we can do all kinds of things. We'll be having this class in space. So just in some ways projecting it forward, right? It's a sort of faith, I think, a kind of investment in the idea of technology. Technology for some is almost like a religion. You're investing your hopes in the future in what it can bring you, especially when you think of technology as being a good thing. That's supposed to make your life easier. That's supposed to make work less hard. Think about the mid-20th century in this country. Things like the washing machine, right, were supposed to change the world, especially for housewives who spend hours upon hours washing clothes. What if you could just throw them in the machine? You have all those extra hours now to do other things. So we understand, I think, the symbolic and practical significance of things like technology. Bellamy and others are, I think, heavily invested in that. But in some ways, it's about people. Right? It's really about people and their willingness to work together as opposed to maybe only working in competition with one another. It's based on this idea of technological advance, but it's also based on this notion of community and things that he noticed in the late 19th century. He thought America has all these resources. It's really about reallocating them so everybody can benefit from them. And again, this in some ways may challenge the whole robber baron notion too. We have these handful of men that control vast resources where you have millions of other people that have nothing. What if we redistribute that so that everybody benefits, right? There's enough resources out there is the idea, but the idea is that it's not distributed equally. Again, in some respects, this reflects sort of Marxist thought as well, sort of socialist or communist thought that everybody should benefit from the society's productivity. You could even go in reverse and look at more traditional societies, Native Americans, right? So the entire society should benefit from the land and other things. So there's a longer history here, but it's also sort of very much tied, I think, to this second industrialization, this sort of turn of the century, becoming modern, all of those questions that we've been sort of playing with. It's not some magical solution. It is going to take work. It is going to take sacrifice of a certain type, but maybe that sacrifice is not putting all your energy into getting rich for yourself, but thinking about how the entire society can benefit. That's a different way of thinking, though, and in some ways, it's radical. We're going to see how a number of groups and individuals may push in that direction in this period. Bellamy's book, people read it, and many people are pushed to action. Right? So it's not just, okay, read it, that was a nice story, and put it down. A lot of folks are going to say this is a blueprint, literally a blueprint for social change. Very much like Harriet Beecher Stowe's book a generation earlier. Right? They read in 1852 this horrible book about racial slavery, and they don't just say, "Oh, that's too bad," and put it down. Many millions of people are saying, "You know what? We need to do something about this. We need to change this. We need to end this institution." Last time I said that Harriet Beecher Stowe's book sold 300 the first 2 years. I meant to say 300,000 the first 2 years. I heard it, and I'm like, wait a second, that didn't make sense. And 2 to 3 million in the first decade. It was a bestseller, so selling 300 wouldn't have been that impressive. Selling 300,000 is much more impressive than that, so I wanted to correct that. The fans of his book take it and they want to apply it in various ways, and they might be impacted in a number of different ways. Many people talk about reading this book and it being a kind of tipping point for them, even though they did not use that language. Bellamy's fans endorsed his program for a new nation, literally a new nation, and they formed nationalist movement. They formed a nationalist movement. Literally, they used that word, nationalist movement. Right? It comes directly out of the publication of Bellamy's book. By the early 1890s, this nationalist movement included over 165 clubs. 165 clubs are formed kind of under this umbrella of this nationalist movement. And even Terence Powderly, founder of the Knights of Labor, declared himself a nationalist. So these are big-time people. These are well-connected people. If we use Gladwell, these sort of connectors, these important, prominent, significant people. And this major labor leader is one of them. So think about his vision. Okay, how are we going to make this society better? How are we going to make it more equitable and just? For Powderly, it's the Knights of Labor. If we can organize workers, then workers can be empowered and millions of people can benefit, not just those that own the factory. So that's one way to interpret this idea, this utopian vision of the country moving forward. Not the only vision, right? Some are not going to go into labor, but he does. Many women suffragists also supported Bellamy's nationalists. So some women are saying, yeah, we can benefit equally as well. And we can perhaps help the society more if we have the right to vote. Right? So you should empower women politically, not just because they don't have that right, but because if you empower half the population, then they can help the rest of the population. Right? Holding down half the population is a bad thing. So famous quote that says, you blind one eye, you can't see nothing. It hurts the whole society, not just the person that you're hurting. So it's interesting that women suffragists as well are going to support this. They approve particularly of Bellamy's depiction of marriage as a union of equals. A union of equals. This is radical thought for the time, right? Marriage at this point is seen as a very traditional thing. Husband is in charge in every way. And the husband has dependents. His children are his dependents, and his wife is his dependent. That's why the argument was she didn't need to vote, because the husband is going to vote for her. Obviously, we challenge some of those ideas in terms of these traditional views. Not all of them, though. Some women are like, hey, this sounds good. This idea of being equal, right, being partners in this relationship. You still hear much more of that type of language now around marriage than you did in the 1890s. Right. So, a lot of labor folks are going to support this. A lot of women are going to support this. Other Bellamy disciples literally form new imagined communities. They literally pick up and move and set up separate communities. Point Loma, where I'm from in San Diego, about 15 minutes from my mom's house, is Point Loma, initially set up based on a separate society, set up around notions of collectivism, collective work, self-sufficiency. They were going to farm and grow crops and then sell those crops and be their own separate community, literally an imagined community. And this is not the only one that would try to do that. This desire is significant, you could argue, at this moment, right? It's literally people reimagining their communities. But they weren't able to bring about the drastic social changes that Bellamy foresaw. They weren't able to sort of take it to where the book ultimately takes it. In part, maybe that was sort of the power of capitalism in this period, right? A lot of folks talk about capitalism as our kind of second national religion. This notion of hard work paying off for the individual and making wealth and these sorts of things as a good thing. Maybe it's not enough to overcome that idea, even though it may temporarily challenge it. It did not lead to an entire nationwide movement. It did not, change government or anything like that. Yet, this is a significant desire, right? It does have a major kind of social impact. And you can identify it, I think we can identify it in multiple movements. We talked about women, we talked about labor, for example. Ordinary citizens are going to seek to renew some of the older values of community, this notion of community, as opposed to just being an individual, that you're connected to a community, and that that entire community perhaps should benefit in some ways, not just individuals. Reformers, labor organizers also are going to take this very seriously, and they would create a major political movement known as populism. Populism. Now, populism is still a term that we use in politics. You'll hear a lot of it going into the upcoming elections. Generally, we use it to talk about a kind of movement among common people, a kind of bottom-up populist movement. We still use that language. In this period, it referred to a specific sort of movement, particularly among working-class people and farmers, sort of trying to change their society, trying to get maybe a bigger piece of the American pie, if you want to look at it that way. So populism is going to be one outgrowth of this, we could argue. At the same time, the working classes are doing their thing. Middle classes also have to rethink individual versus community goals and values. Middle class men and women are in part inspired by a religious movement known as the social gospel. The social gospel movement perhaps can be traced back to this same kind of impulse. Not that you had to read this book to sort of move in this direction, but the society seems to be heavily impacted all around the same time. Remember, the social gospel is this idea that you can't just go to church on Sunday and then go live your regular life the rest of the week. That the ideals that you learn there are supposed to spill out into the streets. So that's a very community way of looking at things, right? That you need to sort of, the entire community should benefit, not just certain individuals. Again, but these movements, even though they have these larger kind of grand goals, are not going to completely change the system. And in some ways, maybe they're not able to deal with some of the everyday challenges, the kind of realities, right? There's theory, and then there's, okay, how does this theory actually translate into everyday life? And sometimes it's difficult, if not impossible, to do that, to translate things into everyday life. How do they deal with some of the contradictions? So, for example, Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow is the law of the land. Does this community extend beyond racial lines? You start to see some maybe movement across class lines. The middle class thinking of themselves perhaps as more connected with the working classes and the poor. But what about black folks? Can they be included? For some folks, that was too much. Or to include women, gender. So for some folks, that was just a bit too much, maybe too fast. So although you see some movements in that direction, there are going to be some contradictions that have to be dealt with. And we actually see worsening racial tensions at the turn of the century. Right? Things actually are getting worse, as we talked about with lynching and other things, race riots that really characterized the early 1900s in this country. I think we talked about this, how in some respects lynching does decline, begins to decline by the 1910s, 1920s. The numbers of lynching victims do go down. At the same time, though, that they're going down, the number of race riots would increase. So in terms of total violence, there probably is more violence, in the early 1900s in many respects. Race riots were kind of mass lynchings in a way. People go into communities and attack whoever they can find of that racial group. There's major race riots, 1899, 1898 in North Carolina, 99, Atlanta, 1906 in Atlanta, 1908 in Springfield, East St. Louis, time after time. Tulsa, Rosewood, Florida. There's various race riots that happen. So in terms of the sheer numbers, it may have actually gotten worse. Yes.
Were the race riots like one way, or were they enacted by like both races?
Good question. Good question. I should have said more about that. Now, when we think race riots, we think Baltimore, right? We think communities of color upset about something, rising up and usually burning stuff in their own communities. 19th and early 20th century race riots were the opposite. Normally, what happened were communities in the white community would go and attack other communities. So they were upset about something, they would go into predominantly African American community and attack anyone they could find. And these happened particularly in the North, which is interesting too, because more folks have begun migrating north. It really isn't until the 1940s, 1950s that you start to see a change in these riots. So things tip. Ultimately, what happens is, particularly the Great Migration and other things that we'll look a little more closely at, is you get creations of things like the South Side of Chicago, a whole bunch of people of color closely living together, right? Or Harlem, now all of a sudden, or Detroit, coming for these factory jobs in Ford and other places. So in 1943, for example, during World War II, there are some major race riots where folks are attacking folks in Detroit. But folks in Detroit are shooting back, right? Or in Harlem, they're shooting back at this point. It becomes more dangerous to just sort of go attack people in communities of color because suddenly there are 10,000 people living there. It's not like, Mississippi on a plantation where there's 2 or 3 people and you're kind of isolated. So ultimately, it's going to change. And now when we think about, riots, we tend to think about, especially after issues of police brutality or whatever in our recent history, people of color being upset. That happened in 1992 when I was in college at UCLA. The LA riots happened here, right? Freddie Gray stuff, or Missouri, right? We're sort of more used to that now. They have changed in terms of their composition. But when they said race riots in this period, it was a different kind of animal. And again, the numbers, in many respects, I don't know, it's hard to argue worse, better. I don't even want to really do that, but I don't want you to be misled in thinking that because lynchings went down that racial issues were better, because they weren't. And there's going to be a lot of violence around labor organizing too. A lot of white workers have problems. 1892 in Homestead in Pennsylvania, those are mostly white workers that are killed. Haymarket, Chicago, 1886. So there's a lot of violence around the society, and a lot of folks are really thinking about what does that mean. What does that mean? There's also this connection between domestic affairs and international affairs. Right? In this period, the United States becomes an empire, particularly with the Spanish-American War, 1898. And some people are making the connection between improving the country at home and seeing the country grow abroad. And some of that is, some people see as racial as well, particularly once the Spanish are defeated, and it's about Cuba and the Philippines, which actually cost more American lives in those parts of the conflict than actually the part with the Spanish. So a lot of folks are rethinking their society, rethinking what America looks like and should look like in this period. They're rethinking the role of government. What should government do? What is the role of government? This is an ongoing question. This is a question we still deal with. Moving into an election year, there are major fundamental differences between the 2 major parties over what should the role of government be. Generally, the Republican Party is in favor of smaller government, not involving themselves and too much in the everyday affairs of people, not too much regulation and these sorts of things. Right? Whereas the Democrats tend to be the opposite. I feel like government has a certain responsibility to provide certain things for its population. There's really a fundamental difference in their philosophy, and this has always been debated among Americans. What should the role of government be? We've seen tremendous changes in this. Remember, this is a period before the Great Depression, before government expands massively, before things like Social Security, before things like disability insurance, unemployment insurance. That stuff didn't exist. Government didn't do that. And we have this major calamity in the form of the Great Depression that really almost causes another civil war in some ways. And some folks say, okay, we need to put certain safeguards in place so that the country can survive. And so there are fundamental differences to this day that are still being debated. We'll hear more about them, I think, as we get deeper and deeper into this election season. So what is the role of government? How much should government be involved in the economy? These are all questions that are being asked and answered differently depending on one's viewpoint, one's view of the world. The size and the scope of government would increase like never before. Government is literally getting bigger and bigger and bigger, employing more and more people, and perhaps taking steps that it hadn't taken before. This expansion may offer certain opportunities, maybe positive and negative opportunities. One, it's going to increase the number of jobs. We know about this, living this close to D.C. How many folks work for the government in some capacity. And these can be really good jobs, good paying jobs, secure jobs. Before the Civil War, local governments dealt mainly with the promotion and regulation of trade. So economic issues would be handled locally in many cases. They would rely on private parties for things like fire departments, water supplies, right? That kind of stuff will be done privately by private companies. As cities grow, though, right, as urbanization increases, these cities get bigger and bigger, more and more people are moving to cities. And as they become more responsible for individuals, more and more would introduce, for example, police and fire departments, financing public education. Some people say this is now the role of government, or should be the role of government in this period that we talked about. Libraries, establishing libraries, parks, things that are for the public good but are provided and or paid for by government and by taxes. There are more federal revenues from taxes and other sources that begin to come in, which again gives the government perhaps more power over time. And it's going to create a much larger bureaucracy. If you try, as we know, you try to get anything done through government, it's a whole bunch of paperwork, takes a long time. Folks will often complain about this. Government has increased massively. I can give you a quick statistic on revenues, the money federal government's bringing in. In 1878, federal revenues were $250 million, $257 million in 1878. By 1900, they've increased to 567, so more than twice as much from 1878 to 1900. Literally, government is growing. You see the creation of new departments in government that didn't exist previously. Literally, government is getting bigger. Bureaus and cabinets like the Department of Agriculture, for example, Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs to sort of deal with the Indian problem, quote unquote, as it was called, deal with Native Americans. The Department of the Treasury, all these departments and bureaus that have certain functions. They're responsible for collecting federal taxes, the Department of Treasury, and printing money and stamps. The Department of Treasury is an interesting one when you think about the money. Literally, they're in charge of the money. The Department of the Treasury grew from 4,000 employees in 1873, 4,000 employees, to how many do you think they have in 1900? They had 4,000 employees in 1873. How many do you think they have in 1900? The Department of the Treasury says in 1873 they have 4,000 employees. How many do you think they might have by 1900, 27 years later? 25,000. They don't just double, they don't just triple, 6 times its size in a 20-year period. Again, it reflects the growth of government. The machinery of politics itself is significant in this period. Gradually, Republicans and Democrats would adapt themselves to this expanding government. They kind of understand government differently, I think, by the end of this period than they did at the beginning. The Republican Party would continue to run and hold their campaigns, put out platforms that stressed its Civil War record. So the Republicans would stress their Civil War record. They would paint themselves as the true Americans, those that had not left the Union, these sorts of things, right? Claiming responsibility for reuniting the nation, reconstructing the nation. The Republican Party would claim that. They would claim that they were the true patriots. So this notion of patriotism, imagine community. They also saw themselves as the Reform Party. And in this period, they're going to start passing various reforms that they saw as improving the society. The Democrats, by contrast, would seek to reduce the influence of the federal government in this period. Remember, it's kind of switched as to how politics are now generally for the parties. The Democrats want to reduce the influence of the federal government. They want to cut spending. They want to remove federal legislation, and they want to protect states' rights. So these are the kind of philosophies at this time. Again, some of these things have changed since then. While Republicans relied on their traditional voters and traditional bases of support, Democrats relied on Southern white voters primarily. Remember, they saw themselves as the party of the South, party of the white man, basically. But also on newly arrived immigrants. They're going to start to try to make inroads in the North by appealing to newly arrived immigrants. develop these whole political machines around appealing to immigrants, providing certain services, but also expecting certain political loyalty and allegiance. Most elections are difficult in this period. There's no real clear winner in many of these, and many of them are hotly debated elections. Neither side controls a clear majority. There are a number of issues that come up that show sort of how the nation is still divided based on region, among other things. The tariff is one example of this. One major political issue that separates the parties. Their vision of the tariff has a lot to do with their political party, has a lot to do with what region you live in as to whether you see it as a good or a bad thing. The tariff was first included in 1789, way back when the nation is new. This idea of how do you raise revenues? How do you raise revenues, particularly in the young republic when it's first founded? So this comes up at that point. It was a fee imposed on imported goods, especially manufactured commodities. So it's going to be a fee on imported goods. It's both political and economic, though. It's a tax, basically, right? A charge, but there's some strong political significance to it. It's not just an economic thing. But it does have an economic function. It's supposed to protect some of the nation's young infant industries, as they call them. These industries that are trying to develop. But it's regional. It's particularly in the north, which is much more industrial. You might have one vision of the tariff as a good thing, whereas in the south you may view it as a negative because of producing more raw materials and things. It may hurt you in terms of trade. So while the southern and western agricultural regions opposed high tariffs, right, they were against high tariffs. I mean, in part it hurt them economically. The north would look at them as favorable. More industrial areas would look at them as favorable. The Democrats, again, with their strong southern support, argue for reductions in the tariff, actually sharp reductions in the tariff. Whereas the Republicans that saw themselves as representing more of the business interests would go the other direction. So it's economic, but it really becomes a political argument, in part because of their, who's voting for you and what's in their interest, what's in the interest of your constituents. Politicians always have to keep that in mind, whether or not they actually agree with it. These elections were characterized by very high voter turnout and participation. During the last quarter of the 19th century, so from 1875 to 1900, participation in presidential elections peaked at almost 80% of the eligible voters. We never get near that now. Much higher rates of participation for eligible voters. Now, remember who's eligible, but this says something. People are feeling very connected to politics in this period. But politics is also problematic in a lot of ways. There's a lot of political mismanagement. Corruption is an issue that you've read about, right? These political machines, for example, might do some shady things. We looked at some of the problems with the railroads and their influence, for example, on politics. Other big business folks and their interests, perhaps illegal interests in politics. And this is a problem as well. The spoils system comes into this, right? The spoils system. Now, that term spoils system comes from the famous phrase, to the victors go the spoils, right? So if you win, then you get the spoils of war. This is sort of, traditional kind of thing. People would rob and pillage villages after they, won a military battle, for example. This idea of the spoils of war has sort of made its way into politics, at least in terms of the language. Right, so the political winners supposedly capitalize on the spoils of victory, the spoils of office. So if you win the election, you would basically throw out everybody that's working previous to you and put all your people in positions of power. So everybody that helped you get elected, they get a job. Now again, is that necessarily bad? Not necessarily. You want people near you can trust and things. But what if they're illiterate? Or what if they don't have any government experience, but you just give them a job because they supported you? This could be seen as problematic, perhaps, for the nation. Not necessarily in the best interest of the nation, but in the best interest of you. So the spoils system is coming under some fire in this period. But basically, its political winners would capitalize on and add to the spoils of office through a complicated system of payoffs. You might give folks a job that supported you. You might pay them under the table in some way or award them certain contracts for supporting you. Again, we can think about how much of this is going to come under some scrutiny. There's going to be a professionalization in politics as well. You got to pass a test now to get a government job, right, to make sure you can do the job. So that has something that has gone through some change over time. For example, this sort of payoffs of this spoils system. For example, legislators supporting government subsidies of railroads. So if you're a politician, you support a lower rate for the railroads, for instance, you might receive a kickback from the railroads. Say, okay, I'll vote this law and that gives you land at $1 an acre. I think that in my next campaign, you should contribute $1 million. Just a suggestion. If I vote this, you do that, right? One hand washes the other. You can see the problems there involved in that. You may be voting for things that are not necessarily in the nation's interest, but they're in your interest. And you essentially then are in bed with the railroads. You might get stock, you might get cash bribes, you might get any number of things, and all of these things would happen particularly around the railroads and some of the other bigger businesses. Some people say, well, that's fine, you've won, you're playing the political game. Others say maybe the game itself needs to change, or maybe we need new rules. You're getting the development of local, powerful political bosses, as were called. Political bosses, people that ran these political machines, particularly in certain cities, New York, Chicago, these cities especially that are growing through immigration, that are growing through migration, have a lot of new immigrants, a lot of working people in them. You could have very powerful local political bosses that start to dominate both parties. Boss Tweed is a good example of one of these bosses in Tammany Hall, New York. Michael Kenna of Chicago. They gave city jobs to loyal voters, to loyal supporters. But they also did, things that were seen as very positive. They did things like distribute holiday food baskets to the poor. Go out and give out 1,000 turkeys in the poorest neighborhoods in their communities. You can understand why people then would look to them and support them as well. If somebody's feeding you, you feel like they have your best interest in mind, and they expect you to vote their direction. Right? They expect you to continue to support them and the party. Now again, what are the problems with this? Well, some of the problem is literally just sort of inconsistency and turnover. Kind of high turnover rate in politics might be a part of the issue here. So if every 2 years or every 4 years a new party wins, there might be tremendous turnover in government. My sister used to work on Capitol Hill, and around the time there was an election, they were always very nervous because if their party lost, they're out of a job. They've worked there for 20 years, but if the new party comes in, chances are you're going to lose your job, and a new wave of folks is going to come in. Now, on some level, maybe new blood is a good thing, but on some level, continued turnover may not be a good thing for the society and for government on a whole. More than 50% of all federal jobs were considered patronage positions, so positions that you got through support. Nearly 56,000 jobs in the 1880s could be rewarded to loyal supporters as kind of the spoils of victory. So this is a massive number of jobs, more than 50,000 in the 1880s. And a large number of them changed hands each time the presidency passed from one party to another. Partly in response to this, some folks start to question whether this is ultimately a bad thing for the society. And you're going to see a number of reformers that say we need to change some things in politics. We need to put some rules in place to govern how we govern, essentially. And also to modernize, to become more modern, to do politics in a more modern way. The Pendleton Civil Service Act is one example of this that I mentioned in the chapter. Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. That called for open competitive examinations. Right? You have to take an open competitive test so that you can then be ranked if you're trying to get a government or civil service job. And it also limited the use of taxes for campaigns. I put some rules in place as to how much you can use for your own campaign, and probably just as importantly, these competitive examinations that are supposed to be open to all, so that you can get the best candidate, most professional candidates in. This is this area of professionalization that I mentioned previously. This professionalization is really mirroring things happening in a larger society generally. There's a movement towards professionalizing a number of aspects. I mentioned the American Medical Association and the American Historical Association. Both of these associations are supposed to make sure that folks have a certain standard of proficiency and that they're doing what they need to be doing and that they're trained properly. Right? You can't just be a doctor anymore. Right? This guy recently in the news was the 18-year-old kid that was posing as a doctor doing various things.
Physical checkups for 2 days, and it wasn't the first time he got arrested for it.
I'm not going to talk about it. But yeah, that's a problem. You find, yeah.
Really, he didn't abuse any of his patients, but what he was doing is still illegal.
Picking his head in for ladies' exams and stuff.
He
might have caught a beat down. I don't know. And it seems like, I don't know, he doesn't seem to understand it either. That's kind of what was
He was defending himself in an interview. He's like, you guys are damaging my business here. I'm trying to help people. And they're like, you can't practice medicine without a medical license.
Can't do it. Can't do it. You can mess around and hop in there and on a surgery. Oh, I got this. Come on, man. But this is, some of the part of the things that would happen. People would represent themselves in a certain way and do surgeries and things, and folks are dying. This literally could cost people their lives. So this notion of professionalization is not without tremendous importance. These farmers, right? It's not just middle class folks, but farmers and working class people are again enhancing and thinking about their role in this society as well. Farmers would begin organizing right after the Civil War, especially. They start thinking of, we're the ones that produce food, right? Who's more American and more patriotic than the farmer? In many respects, they saw themselves as developing opposed to the quote-unquote powerful classes. Yeah, those people have more money than us, but they're not more American in the sense they're not more worthy. Right? They see themselves as being exploited, particularly by the railroads and others. Right? If you're growing a crop, you have to get that crop to market. You are reliant, sometimes dependent on the railroads and other things to do that. But they start to think, how can we come together as a group and improve our position? How can we form an imagined community of farmers and do things like get better railroad rates? Right? Because as an individual, maybe you're charged $20 to ship, each pound. As a group, with 1,000 farmers, you might be able to get a better rate, right? So this notion of community extends in that direction. By the end of the century, those communities that are most dependent on the railroads, right, those that feel most dependent or even exploited by the railroads, would start to present the biggest challenge to the two-party political system. They are literally going to form their own political party and challenge the Democrats and Republicans moving forward. This is populism. This is populism. It's going to be the most powerful political challenge since the Civil War to the two-party system. It starts early on, perhaps locally. Right? In 1867, white farmers in the Midwest would form what they called the Patrons of Husbandry. Patrons of Husbandry. It was a fraternal society, similar to other kind of social societies, clubs at this time. But again, it's going to continue to develop this Patrons of Husbandry. In many societies, the headquarters of the local chapter of the Patrons of Husbandry, their headquarters, their clubhouse, was called the Grange. They called it the Grange. Ultimately, this becomes known as the Granger movement. These Patrons of Husbandry, these farmers coming together to ultimately challenge what they see as problematic in their society. The Grange would become the main kind of social center, or a place for activism and organizing and bouncing ideas around. And it's going to spread, particularly in the 1870s during these economic depressions and downturns. A lot more people start thinking, wait a second, maybe there are some better opportunities available. Maybe we can do things a little differently. Grangers tended to blame the hard times on the railroads and on these big money folks, bankers, those powerful folks, especially in the North and East. If you're in the Midwest or the South, you may feel that you're being taken advantage of regionally as well as based on your class. They wanted to buy less from others and produce more. They wanted to kind of change the power relationship that way. So what do? They would create systems of cooperative businesses, pool their resources, cooperative businesses for both buying supplies that they all needed and for selling their crops that the rest of the nation needed. They even would begin manufacturing some of their own machinery. So they're coming together not just as individual farmers, but as a group. Again, this depression of the 1870s, though, is going to kill many of these programs, some before they really can get started. But it is an early model of kind of collective action. It is an early model of collective action. The difficulty for farmers doesn't end in the 1870s. It's going to continue. And in fact, we see more of these movements, particularly in the South. In the 1880s, farmers would organize against both poverty and the crop lien system. This idea of having a lien against the crops, even crops that aren't even grown yet. Right? In the New South, many newspapers in the New South, for example, people would advise farmers to do things like diversify their crops and come together as a group so that they can exercise more power. But they had some fundamental problems. They're still relying on railroads. They still have to ship their goods to market. In response to this, Texas farmers would begin organizing cooperatives. And the Southern Farmers Alliance, as it was called, Southern Farmers Alliance, became an alternative to the capitalist marketplace for many white farmers. They say, look, we're going to come together. We'll only sell our stuff as a group. Some say that's socialism. It's not individual bargaining. They say, look, we're going to try to improve our position. Southern Farmers Alliance. The Colored Farmers Alliance, organized on its own in Texas and Arkansas in 1886, is the same thing among African American farmers who weren't initially allowed in the others. They're going to have 1 million members shortly. And sometimes the two alliances would work together, but never without problems. Right? Race would always rear its head. The Northern Farmers Alliance would form in the Great Plains areas, and all these farmers are starting to see their economic power and ultimately their sort of political power here. And ultimately this would become a political movement and literally a political party in the populace or People's Party that you've sort of read about. Okay. Run out of time. I'm going to stop there.